to History Class with Dr. W and our study of the year 1968. We've returned to the American home front for our last few lectures in the course. And over these next couple of lectures, I'm going to talk about what life was like for many Americans. What kind of things were they engaged in on the American home front? And this lecture will focus on a series of social movements, beginning with part one about the feminist movement. This lecture is not intended to be a comprehensive study of the feminist movement or even of their involvement in 1968. For those who are taking my class on 1968, I'll provide additional resources, and for those listening otherwise, I encourage you to study this movement more broadly if you're interested in it. For this lecture, I'm going to focus on a particular episode in 1968, one of the most visible and memorable events in the United States of that year, the protests around the 1968 Miss America Pageant. A radical feminist named Carol Hanisch came up with the idea to protest the Miss America Pageant. She thought, quote, "It just might be the way to bring the fledgling women's liberation movement into the public arena." The New York radical women originated as a small group of women brought together during the civil rights and anti-war protests. As they engaged in these other protests, they found themselves often demeaned and pushed aside by the male-dominated leadership of those movements. And so a small group of them started their own organization and began setting their own agenda. Women coming to the meetings began to recognize a set of shared experiences. Their individual complaints were universal. The phrase, "the personal is political," was born in those meetings. The Miss America pageant originated in the 1920s, essentially as a marketing tool. Newspapers and the resorts on the East Coast used the pageant to increase newspaper sales and draw tourists to the resorts. There were contests all over the country, with the final contest held in Atlantic City, New Jersey. Since its earliest days, the Miss America pageant had emphasized narrow interpretations of beauty and had emphasized physical qualities over intellect or talent. It had also, in its early years, been blatantly racist, as African American women were explicitly not allowed to participate in the early years. The winner of the pageant typically spent the year engaged in community service and also advertising sponsors' products and at times performing for U.S. troops overseas and around the country. To members of the New York radical women, the Miss America pageant also represented a part of their shared negative experiences of sexism in America. They all seemed to have similar memories of watching and reading about the pageant and feeling belittled and excluded. While they didn't agree immediately as to what form the protest should take, they all agreed that the Miss America pageant should be a target of their protests. On August 22, 1968, the New York radical women issued a press release inviting women of every political persuasion to the Atlantic City boardwalk to protest the event during the contest on September 7th. They opposed the oppression represented by the contest and would feature a freedom trash can where women would throw away various types of restrictive clothing, such as bras, girdles, and wigs, or issues of magazines peddling certain stereotypes, like Cosmopolitan, Ladies' Home Journal, and others, or other implements of oppression, like hair curlers, dryers, and so on. Protest organizers also proposed a boycott of companies sponsoring the pageant, and that male reporters would not be allowed to interview the protesters. Organizers also issued what they called a womanifesto, with 10 reasons explaining their protest. Among them, the racist history of the competition, as there had never been a black contestant and no Native American woman had ever won. The role of Miss America as what they called a death mascot for the troops. The corporatism of the event, and what they called the degrading, mindless, boob girly symbol. No more Miss America, the womanifesto said. On September 7th, several hundred women gathered at the boardwalk for the protest. While most of them were young white women, their numbers included black and white, young and old, from all over the country. The media took many pictures of the women, who carried posters with slogans saying, "All women are beautiful," "Cattle parades are demeaning to human beings," and "Can makeup hide the wounds of our oppression?" The women also engaged in street theater. One woman mopped the boardwalk while carrying her child and pots and pans. An African-American woman and lawyer named Florence Kennedy chained herself to a puppet of Miss America to, quote, highlight the ways women were enslaved by beauty standards. She described the protest as, quote, comparable to peeing on an expensive rug at a polite cocktail party, a shocking action that was sure to inspire a response. A centerpiece of the protest, and among its most remembered features, was the Freedom Trash Can. Media pictures of women throwing their bras and other items in the can are well-remembered images of 1968, and they sparked the stereotype of the bra-burning feminist. However, the women were not actually allowed by authorities to light the fire because the wooden boardwalk was flammable. Despite the fact that there was no fire, the myth of the bra burning took hold, and some media members grabbed onto it. Humor columnist Art Buchwald wrote in the New York Post, "The final and most tragic part of the protest took place when several of the women publicly burned their brassieres. If the average American female gave up all her beauty products, she would look like Tiny Tim, and there would be no reason for the American male to have anything to do with her at all." Encapsulating in a few sentences what many of the women were protesting about. The women rented a sheep from a nearby farm to parade around, a statement of how they felt about the treatment of the contestants. And they made a huge cardboard cutout of a contestant with exaggerated features. Their reception at the scene was mixed. Of course, many women joined in the protests. Some men observed at the fringes of the protest, some in support of the protesters, some opposed to them, others simply captivated by the scene. Men passing by applauded or cheered. Others jeered or whistled, shouting insults or catcalls. Sometimes couples walked by, the man yelling insults. Some of those women came back later to grab a button or participate. During the competition, Carol Hanisch and a few others managed to sneak into the hall and captured a few moments on national television, yelling, "Women's liberation," and "No more Miss America." The women managed to hang a banner made from sheets with the slogan "Women's Liberation" written on them, and pictures of the scene have become iconic remembrances of 1968 and the launching of the feminist movement. A few blocks away, at the Atlantic City Ritz-Carlton, the Philadelphia entrepreneur J. Morris Anderson held the inaugural Miss America Pageant. The winner, Sandra Williams, declared, "Miss America does not represent us because there has never been a black girl in the pageant. With my title, I can show black women that they too are beautiful." Scholars, participants, and critics of the protest continue to debate what impact the protest had, good and bad. Certainly, the protest gained publicity for what we now call second-wave feminism. The first wave of feminism, prominent in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, focused on the right to vote and basic representation. By the 1960s, women clamored for equality of opportunity and sweeping changes to America's patriarchal society. The Miss America protest publicized those efforts as little else had up to that point. It also represented the first time that women oversaw their own protest. Many of them had been activists for years, and they understood the workings of protest organizations, but they'd always done it at the behest of men up to that point. Now, in 1968, they took charge of their own movement and decided on their own actions. It was exciting and empowering. At the same time, critics of the protest note that the media panned their efforts, and they were not taken entirely seriously by the media. More scholarly critiques note that the protest represented only one slice of American women at that time, and that the protesters themselves did not truly reflect all women in America. Carol Hanisch herself, just a few months after the protest, wrote, "One of the biggest mistakes of the whole pageant was our anti-womanism. Miss America and all the beautiful women came off as our enemy instead of our sisters who suffer with us." Some of the women regret some of the methods they used, or some of the posters and slogans, which with the passage of time come across as derogatory to women themselves. As Robin Morgan, one of the organizers of the protest, has said, "For instance, it wasn't fair to compare the contestants to sheep. The best way to organize is not by insulting the people that you're trying to organize. And it wasn't fair to the sheep. My consciousness was not what it should have been at that point about animal rights in parading our ewe around. But in time, you learn those things." Following the Miss America protest, membership in the New York Radical Women's Organization surged. At the same time, as the numbers swelled, it became more challenging to maintain a unified message and course of action, and factions in the movement became more prominent. As the movement carried forward into the 1970s, the challenges of maintaining a single voice for women of different races, social backgrounds, economic backgrounds, and political inclinations became insurmountable. When the Equal Rights Amendment proposing equal rights for women came up for ratification in the 1970s, it was largely the opposition of some women that managed to ensure that it was never ratified. In some ways, the battles that women were fighting in the 1960s continue even today.